I'm Sue, and I've been a good friend of Muriel's. This is bad if I start now. For the last 36 years, and it's really a privilege to conduct this service in Muriel's honor. Less than 10 minutes after Muriel's death was announced this Sunday morning, a flood of grief, gratitude, and love, testimony to how much Muriel has meant as a friend, colleague, teacher, supervisor, analyst, writer, began to overwhelm our computers and phones. Her good friend Robert noted that it was Valentine's Day and wrote, "All this love coming towards her. It is devastating and oh so beautiful." And this was just the beginning of that love. Many here today have seen the outpouring of recollections and tributes that have been coming in. Muriel touched so many people's lives, influenced so many people's ideas, that it really requires another occasion, a moment when we can celebrate Muriel's life and accomplishments. We'll hear a lot about Muriel's intellectual life, her contributions to psychoanalytic thought and to feminism at a memorial service this spring. And those of you not on the list should be sure that you've signed in with your email so that you'll get announcements of that. Today, though, is more personal, a moment for us to acknowledge the loss that we're feeling and sense the full arc of Muriel's life. And we'll hear a good friend from many wonderful times in the Hamptons, a good friend of Muriel's, will play the saraband from the second Bach cello suite. Thanks, Steve. This is a funeral, so mainly we'll be speaking about all the wonderful things about Muriel. But those of us who knew her well also know that she could be complicated and difficult at times. Maybe you didn't even have to know her that well to know that, but and I can imagine it wasn't always easy being her younger brother. But in this last period of Muriel's life, it was clear how much she valued Michael's judgment and realized how much he could be a source of comfort and stability. And he'd like to say a few words.
Thanks, Sue. Muriel wanted this to be an occasion to say goodbye. She directed me here to bring you all here. In her way, she was directing, and maybe she still is. But she was a personage. She was held in admiration and love by so many people. Her friends, her colleagues, students, patients, mentors, mentees. The flood of messages, as Sue mentioned, the phone calls, postings, texts, has just been amazing. More than I knew, she touched and stayed in contact with so very many. If life has meaning, I can see it in her friends, and I can see it in this room. The last few days were made bearable because of a core group of friends: Sue, Valletta, Javier, Harriet, Kenny, Ginger, Katie, Seth, my wife Kelly, my daughter Abby, and more. Stood by her bedside, held her hands and mine. Thank you. Spoke loving words in her ear, and she heard them. She smiled when Seth arrived after a red eye and laughed at some of our corny jokes, but the best was the forced resignation of Justice Scalia. I know our laughing and cheering helped Muriel in her somberest moments. I can't fully express my gratitude to the members of Team Muriel who stayed with her at all hours. She was never alone. A few years ago, I spoke at an occasion similar to this. It took place in a huge white tent in a green pasture in Wyoming, surrounded by the Tetons. I recited an E.E. Cummings poem, not so easy to say at this moment, an E.E. Cummings poem which described a man who wore his life the way the mountains wear the sky. It was entirely appropriate for the man whose life we were celebrating. And I've come to see that those words fit Muriel perfectly as well. I'd like to try to read that poem again. A great man is gone, tall as the truth was who, and wore his mountains understand how life, like a now with one sweet sun in it, now with a million flaming billion kinds of nameless silence sky.
Thanks. Michael mentioned Muriel lighting up when Seth arrived. I don't know of anyone who's had a stronger, more consistent relationship with an ex-husband than Muriel and Seth. I'd never met Seth before this past weekend, but I first grasped the depth of his love for Muriel when he visited her 8 years ago when she first was battling lung cancer. Later, I knew that Seth, a classic scholar, gave her the title for her paper, Lapsus Linguae. And then over the last months, when Muriel struggled to adjust to her terminal diagnosis, I realized how much she looked forward to his visits and counted on his support. And on Friday night in the hospital, I saw her face light up as she heard his voice on the phone before boarding a plane from California so he could be by her side as she lay dying.
Hi.
I want to remember Muriel as I knew her in a period of her life before she became the analyst, theorist of gender and sexuality, and teacher and mentor whom most people here knew, admired, and loved. Muriel and I met when she was 19 and I was 20. We got married 3 years later and stayed together for 11 more years. After our marriage ended, we remained friends, even though we didn't see one another all that often. We continued to care for and trust one another, bonded as we were by having come of age together and having shared and helped to shape each other's lives in those formative years from the early 1960s to the mid-1970s, when we were active in the anti-war, civil rights, and women's movements, and together discovered the pleasures of music, travel, and so much more. These were also the years when we went to graduate school, read, edited, and critiqued each other's work, and helped each other to write our dissertations, find our first jobs, and finish our first books. I went with Muriel in 1967, 1968 as a kind of all-purpose research assistant when she did her doctoral field study of a shepherd community in northwestern Greece. Her dissertation and several of her earliest articles came from this study. And I remember how excited and pleased she was when she was introduced once to Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he recognized her name and complimented her as, quote, the author of that penetrating article on women in a Greek mountain village, unquote. That field work is the prime example of an experience, one of so many experiences that only the two of us shared. And I'm desolated by having no one to share it with anymore now that Muriel is gone. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, when she was completing her thesis and later teaching anthropology at Lehman College and writing The Anthropological Imagination, Muriel belonged to several transformative women's groups, some of the members of whom are here. At the same time, she was well into her long and at least as transformative analysis, in which she began to process the unexpected and devastating death of her and Michael's mother at the time she was 20, which had shadowed her life since then. Her analysis, more than anything else, made her want to become an analyst, even though she had no previous training and had never, ever taken a psychology course. It was not long afterward that our marriage ended, and there are others here who can tell the rest of Muriel's story better than I can. In these last sad days, it's been a privilege and a pleasure for me to learn more about Muriel from some of her closest friends, colleagues, and students. I feel enriched by an enhanced sense of who my Muriel became and of the impact she had on others, personally and professionally. A sense that I will treasure along with my own memories of our time together.
one of the people who knows Muriel from that time of political activism and in that moment of transition is Harriet, and she'll be speaking next.
How does one talk about a 40-year friendship when you feel like you just had part of your heart ripped out? How do you capture the deep love, the shared contemplation of all matters, the differences and inevitable angers, the feminist barricades, marching, picketing, designing flyers and T-shirts, the caring, support, advice on daily living, and most important, helping me to breathe, give birth, and bring my daughter Sasha into the world. To truly name and convey the depth of all this is an impossible task. The Buddhist teacher, poet, and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, who was suffering his own health challenges, writes in his book, How to Love, "The more you understand, the more you love. The more you love, the more you understand. And when we learn to live and understand ourselves and have true compassion for ourselves, then we can truly love and understand another person." This was my unfinished project with Muriel, and I see now this was the true meaning of our friendship. The last few months have been especially hard for those of us accompanying Muriel on her journey. The discussions on the dearth of joy, feeling unlike herself, wondering if living still had meaning, and the why of keeping going. I always tried to engage and be direct, to answer, no, it wasn't going to get better, but you could still live while dying. I did get her to agree that people coming over brought light, but she was clear that darkness came as soon as they left. So we made sure there were people radiating that light after the sacred morning hours when she still had the energy to write and neatly wrap up all of her affairs. Special gratitude to Sue Shapiro, who spent many hours guiding Muriel and the rest of us through the medical labyrinth, demystifying the hypotheses, suppositions, and doctor speak, and providing some clarity for the difficult decisions that had to be made. It seems that those of us who surrounded Muriel brought to her our best and urgently needed gifts. It was a rough time since Muriel's diagnosis and all the attempts to arrest and accept it. Being sick was not Muriel's forte. She fought it, she refused it, and feared it. She simply didn't know how to do it. To ease this pain, I found what I thought was the perfect book, How to Be Sick, by Toni Bernhard, an accomplished woman, legal scholar and professor, a Buddhist whose own severe and debilitating illness forced her to give up her life's work as well. Muriel was intrigued by the title, but reading was not on her agenda. Only gradually did she glance through it as I pushed the fact that this how-to book had tools that she might use as well. Slowly, she began to take it from the untouched piles of books and magazines on her coffee table and read it slowly. One day, we were discussing a new venture of mine, and she said she envied me, as this could no longer happen for her. But a week later, she told me she had learned something new from the book. Mudita, she said, which is the Pali word for sympathetic joy, or joy unadulterated by self-interest. She said she was trying to practice feeling joy for the joy she knew that I felt embarking on my new project, and this was my final gift from her. While I sat at Muriel's bedside and watched her labored breathing, I silently recited, "May you be free of physical and psychic pain. May you have ease of breath. May you find peace, freedom, and forgiveness. on the road ahead. And now that Muriel is somewhere far out on that road, I know she is still supported by the love and light we all brought to her in gratitude for the many gifts she brought to us. May we all savor the joy, love, and friendship we have had with Muriel and continue to spread it freely to others as an ongoing healing offering in her honor.
Thanks so much, Harriet. It sort of moves easily into a meditation that in the last 10, 15 years, Muriel and Karen, Sarah, and I have been meeting once a week, meditating, and seeing each other through really difficult times. Often meditation wound up at the last 5 minutes. But I know in the last several months that Muriel meditated a lot. So Karen from our weekly meditation group wrote, citing Thich Nhat Hanh, "Oh Muriel, I imagine you have awakened from your forgetfulness and transcended the path of anxiety and sorrow. Listen, listen. This wonderful sound brings you back to your true home. We will miss you in our breathing in and breathing out, and in the same time, you will be very much with us. And there'll be moments in the next half hour or so that to pause and breathe in and out as we share our experience of being alive, even as we share our deep sense of loss." So I had a lot of trouble, not surprisingly, trying to write anything at this point, write a eulogy, but decided I should say a few things about my relationship with Muriel. I'm not sure when we first met how we became friends, but ever since we collaborated at the postdoc weekend in 1980 on a presentation we called "What Do We Secretly Believe is Mentally Healthy?" Way ahead of when we all started thinking and writing about that more. We've had a deep, mutually enriching, even if in some ways unlikely, friendship. I sometimes thought of us as the odd couple. Muriel was incredibly organized and disciplined, and you can imagine me. But how else could she have accomplished so much? She loved writing, playing with words and ideas, psychoanalytic theory. She was always skeptical about science and embraced postmodernism. That was something we often argued about. She thought she would live a long life, and so was always really careful about spending money. I thought I'd die young, so I didn't want to put off pleasures and adventures. She was supposed to help me out at this point in life. I'm also 5 years younger than Muriel, and that made a huge difference in the way the 60s influenced our lives. Sex, drugs, not so much rock and roll, but the other two, were part of my life before leaving college. And by the time I met Muriel, I was sort of straightening out, getting married, however briefly, and I'd been seeing patients since 1968. Muriel was transitioning, still teaching anthropology, but eager to be fully into her new career. I think our friendship was forged over a certain irreverence that we shared, a mischievousness perhaps, and we egged each other on. While she introduced me to feminist theory, I introduced her to the ball work, a kind of body work, and yoga, alternative forms of healing and body work. For most of the time we knew each other, we were both single, and as our friend Marcel Clemens put it, improvised women, finding new ways of establishing emotional security through friendships and new ways of being generative, not only through work, but through our relationship with godchildren, and later, especially for Muriel, with her students, especially those in her writing group, who she referred to as her kids. Just as Muriel was opening me to new ideas and ways of thinking, I became her trusted guide in the early years of her clinical practice. In 1986, when Frank Goldberg asked me to give a talk on feminism and psychotherapy to the Jewish board, it was natural for me to suggest that I do it with Muriel. I couldn't imagine being able to do that alone. Some of my happiest times with Muriel were working together at my beach house on our talk, Trouble Between Women. Little did either of us realize how powerful the forces of envy and competition could be in our own lives, how much trouble between women we would each experience. Our talk was so popular, we gave it numerous times over the next 10 years, but we could never turn it into a paper. While we both liked to bring different ideas together and see their mutual influence, I was never interested in developing new theory. Muriel was all about that, and early on voiced a concern that we were using a familiar binary story of development in describing women's relationships, and she would not publish until she developed a new theory. And indeed, it took what we came to call the Gang of Four, Muriel, Adrienne Harris, Jessica Benjamin, and Virginia Goldner. It took them and the birth of the relational track and all the energy that was generated there for the necessary step into developing her own new theories. Muriel's thinking took off, and it never stopped. She became a sought-after teacher, supervisor, and speaker, something we'll hear much more about at the memorial. But over the years of friendship, we held surprise parties for each other and comforted each other when we felt slighted, encouraged each other, decided what to wear when we had to give a talk or on occasions like this. And just this December, Muriel gave me some makeup tips when we got to take her on a trip to Florida. I don't know if Muriel had a messy drawer, but I do have a neat one. I can be really organized when it comes to other people's medical care. It's a strange kind of talent. I kind of like hospitals, feel comfortable and confident speaking with doctors and reading medical records. It was a real shift in our relationship because in so many other ways, Muriel was much more confident. Shortly after we became friends, I entered one of the most difficult periods of my life, in which eight members of my family died. It was actually the first time I ever came here was then, and many of the dreams I had from my life were lost. I'll never forget that Muriel was there the day that I learned that my piano teacher of 35 years was dying of pancreatic cancer, and that my mother's cancer had spread to her liver. It was clear that she would be gone soon also. We leaned on each other through so many funerals, and as I wrote this last night, I realized suddenly this would be my first funeral that I went to without her. No wonder I was feeling so scared and bereft. We could each be our craziest, most frightened selves with each other. Whether it was my call from Libreville in Gabon, terrified before taking ibogaine in the jungle, crying to Muriel that the sky was white. And she said, "Oh, Susie, it's just cloudy." At times, we were tough with each other, Her incredibly detailed edits on an article I wrote made me dizzy and weep with frustration. I had never used track changes before, and I just couldn't see. All I saw were red lines and all this stuff, but I knew that her criticisms and revisions came from her determination to make my essay the best it could possibly be. And I hope Muriel knew when I was tough with her these last months, it was because I loved her so much and knew that worse was coming, and she needed to make the most of the time she had left. I've been managing a lot these last months, and I know a lot of my feelings will hit me later after today is over. But what was striking was that I kept it together Friday in the hospital. But then Saturday morning, when I saw Friday night, seeing Sasha, Harriet's daughter, weeping as she touched Muriel's arm tenderly, feeling Sasha's sadness reconnected me to all the feelings I'd been trying to hold in check. And the next day when I walked into the hospital room and burst into sobs, it was Sasha who held me. And I knew that we brought a generation of people who could take us the next way. So I think I'll go on to change gears. In the last days and months of Muriel's illness, her good friend Valletta was just extraordinary. She accompanied Muriel to many things she had to do, but she cooked for her. Every week she would cook and bring food in containers for Muriel to take to work while she was still working, to have home-cooked meals at night. Often she would sit with her. They were able to be together, be alone in the presence of each other. And that provided enormous comfort to Muriel. I don't know how she could have gotten through these last months without your help. And Loretta will speak some now.
We are here, all of us, to hold Muriel in our minds and hearts. And together, consider the way that she touched our lives. Today, we pay our respect to an extraordinary woman. I'm honored to have been her friend, colleague, and eternal student. And I am most honored to speak about her today, although I'm not sure I'm going to be able to speak for very long. There have been many reminiscences about Muriel floating around the internet and the listservs of various institutes. My thought is that she would be surprised at how many people all over the world she touched and reached. I do not think she let herself know just how much of an impact she had. I, too, find myself revisiting moments with Muriel, trying to turn back time and hold it still in my memory, hanging on to conversations, silences, dinners, walks, and vacations taken together. So many things done. So many more she would have taken on. But Muriel ran out of time. She might have been petite in size, but boy, was she a force. An intellectual powerhouse, a woman to be reckoned with. And in my academic career, the first female mentor, and someone who showed me that not only did she not need to man up, but instead she stood up with courage, compassion, and grace. My dear M, as I was and am still fond of calling her, demanded truth and honesty always, and most particularly from her friends. In return, she offered warmth, love, and a loyalty so fierce as to create a force field around those she loved. And this made everything possible and every disagreement fun. She made the world a little safer, a lot brighter, and a whole lot more fun. And I will miss her evermore. M brought her passion for life into everything she did. She was real with a capital R. She walked her talk. And you always knew what to expect with Muriel. Honesty, clarity, curiosity. She was provocative always and had a singular, keen vision of what needed to be done, what needed to be said, and what needed to be written. She shook us up as if waking us to become real, to have courage enough to be. Muriel destabilized all of us often because she was able to look in and out, to walk the edges, to break polarities and create, and here's a favorite phrase of hers, a third space. She pushed us, she pushed me forward and sideways. Directionality was never the issue, perspective, and the questioning of whichever position you took was actually the issue. She looked at things straight on, squarely, but then she would look around the edges, underneath, examine all the wrinkles, and apply her brilliant mind to doing it all over again until she was satisfied, until it made sense anew, until it made the rest of us think. Because thinking outside and beyond the outside was commonplace to her, she established a reputation for taking on hard subjects, the stuff that others would not even think of thinking, much less theorize about. This cost her plenty, both politically and personally, but it never stopped her. Instead, her voice matured over time and gathered strength. She made waves, big ones, but then she always loved the ocean, and Neptune loved her back. Em and I attended the Abramovich performance on silence and Bach's Goldberg variations this past November. It was a rare outing for her, perhaps even her last. We sat, absurdly in lawn chairs, holding hands during the 10 minutes of total silence imposed by the noise-canceling headphones we had been instructed to wear. My not wanting to let go for fear that the silence would be too much for her. forgetting momentarily that Muriel was no stranger to silence, but instead knew it intimately and often wrapped herself in its veil. Forgetting that greatness was born many times from that silence. The stillness was followed by the beauty of Bach. She smiled at me and squeezed my hand. All was well and not well. Time, that sets all limits, also offers us the chance at freedom from limits. We are not trapped after all. That which is lost is found again in our hearts, always. So let the last words be hers.
Well, we have a few more last words. From Avyi's going to speak, and I have to say that I think the purest form of love Muriel was able to give was with Sasha and Abby, and then with her writing group students, who she spoke of as her kids. And she was so proud of them. And even when you look at her sign-off, her signature in her email, it has the book that's an edited book from the writing group, from her students. She was just so proud. And Avyi came to the hospital, and she was incredible. And thank goodness for the next generation, because Avyi had the 1 in the morning to 5 or 6 in the morning shift. She was able to stay up and sit with Muriel and let us old folks get a little bit of rest before we came back to the hospital. There was great love between Muriel and Avyi, and I'm glad she'll be able to speak to us.
Muriel was magic. I first met Muriel at the NYU postdocs orientation when I was a beginning candidate. I approached her with equal measures of a novice deference and wide-eyed admiration. Muriel had had a deep fondness for Greece, where she had done part of her research, and her eyes lit up when she realized that I'm Greek. That's how our relationship started, a mixture of veneration and coincidence. Over the years, our relationship traveled from invaluable supervisor and supervisee to daring teacher to loving mentor to close, really close friends, and finally to a form of kinship that I experienced as family. Throughout our friendship, Muriel would sometimes speak to me in Greek. Depending on the occasion, it sometimes would be about signaling intimacy, and at others, it was more of a conspiratorial mischief when she wanted to say something that those dining at the table next to us were better off not hearing. Many of us have felt that from her. To be loved by Muriel meant that she could speak to you in your own language, that she could take on your emotional dialect to say, I see you, and I'm here, I'm with you. Muriel sprinkled a dash of her magic on me. Some time into my supervision with her, Muriel made a passing reference to feminism. Looking back at it now, I'm sure that it wasn't the first one. I'm sure that she probably did it at the very first meeting. But I, who had been entirely illiterate about these matters, heard it first for a first time then. And it must have also been the first time that she realized my ignorance, because trying to suppress her disbelief, she said to me, you've heard of Gloria Steinem before, right? You've studied feminism in college, yes? And I mumbled something about how in Greece feminism had been a dirty word and that I in fact knew exactly zero about it. And she became concerned and she said to me, oh, sweetie, You won't be able to do anything without feminism. And she stared at me, her mind running a mile a minute, as it often did, and she matter-of-factly shrugged her shoulders as if she was left no choice, and she said, well, I guess I'll just have to teach it to you. And 2 weeks later, an announcement appeared on our professional listserv that she was forming a reading group on the foundations of feminist theory. There were 2 people in that group, but she ran it for 2 years anyway, and that was Muriel. Even with the neophyte in her hand, she was dedicated to teaching. She was staunchly committed to bringing others along. Her resolve to pass on her wealth of knowledge was steadfast, no matter what or how much labor that required on her end. Muriel also sprinkled a splash of her magic on a new generation of theorists. Several years ago, I joined this writing group that Sue mentioned and Valletta mentioned, that she led. The group was an exercise in enchantment, and I want to tell you why. You would come to the group, an anxious newbie, and you would want to talk about your conflicts about writing, about the anxiety that overtook you and left the page blank. And Muriel would tell you, bring anything, bring a paragraph, bring a sentence, bring a word. The truth is that nobody, as far as I can recall, ever brought just a word. But some of us would email the group a mere sentence or 2 before the next meeting, and Muriel would open the meeting with her signature sentence, what help do you need from us? So you got to define what you needed, and by implication what you didn't, and Muriel made sure that we all remembered what was being asked of us and what was not. She had the talent of reading through a paper and know what you were trying to do, even when the rest of us only heard the author's personal struggle with writing, but also with their past and with their life. But Muriel had a sense of how that which would have otherwise been mere emotional debris could be turned into a contribution. She would fish into our ramblings and into our paragraphs for that special hidden word or sentence and say, there's your idea, that's what you're trying to say it, don't bury it at the end of your paragraph. And then she would instruct others, stop talking, let her write it down. And she would wait while you would furiously jot down notes, and at the time we all thought we were writing down phrases or ideas, but I know now that we're writing down, this is what it's like to be found. Muriel knew how to come looking for you, and she knew how to find you. And she knew how to draw you out by making you feel that you had something to say, and that she was interested, and that the group was interested, and that if you let yourself say it, the world might be interested too. So sometimes you would leave that group feeling that you alone could personally conquer the intellectual universe. And when you came down from your drunken state, Muriel was there to tell you with integrity what didn't work. I remember the first paper I finished and how I eagerly awaited for her feedback. You're in for a few rewrites, she said to me soberly. And with the face that I would actually be up for the task, and part of the gift of being mentored by Muriel meant that she didn't treat you as fragile. Eventually, some of that rubbed off on us, and we became able to do that for each other, and over some time, even for ourselves. On the level of the work, it would be accurate to say that Muriel gave us her attention, but on the level of experience, it would be accurate to say, as Ayal recently wrote, that Muriel raised us. I'm sure that this is an experience that was shared by many others, students, supervisees, patients, even her peers, and I say peers because that was another part of Muriel's magic. She knew what you didn't know and what you felt insecure about, but she still treated you like a peer. She was interested in what we all thought and found wonder and value in our embryonic ideas, and for a moment you believed that you too had something to say. And she would bring her work to our group and ask for our critiques and our suggestions, and would even at times incorporate them. Muriel was encouraging of our individual ideas, but she was always staunchly on the side of the collective. On one particular occasion, an issue arose in the group about what idea belonged to whom. In an environment of intellectual cross-pollination, it's hard to know whose comment was a response to whose thought and which one was originally yours. So I asked Muriel about this conundrum in private, and she said to me, that's not the right framework. You can't build borders around ideas and call them yours. Ideas emanate from one, but they really belong to everybody. As an anthropologist, Muriel believed this very deeply. She believed in the power of the group and to collectivity. So it is not a surprise that when Muriel was diagnosed this summer, a very tight group formed around her, providing home-cooked meals. Help with medical attention, support, advice, care, love, and at times, dishwashing. On Friday and Saturday, when Muriel was in the hospital, several people visited, flew in, sent emails and videos, and she was never alone. She was always surrounded by a group. On Sunday morning, Veleda and I were lucky enough to be with her when she drew her last breath. The nurse came in to take her pulse, and there was none. As she started walking away, the nurse paused and turned to us, and she said, "Who was she? She had so many people by her side." None of us wanted to leave the hospital that morning. We lingered in the waiting room, not wanting to separate from each other. And on Monday morning, Sue wrote to us all, "It's hard to come back into my skin and out of our collective body." And that was the magic of Muriel. She leaves behind not just an incredibly rich intellectual legacy, but a collective, all of us. Being in a collective does not stop the hurt, but it helps with being able to suffer it. Thank you, Muriel. We'll miss you beyond words.
As we're getting to the close, Ken Corbett, a good friend of Muriel's and office mate, is going to read a poem, and then Lou will chant El Mole Rachamim, and then we can all say Kaddish, those of us who are familiar with it. I guess just as Muriel was an improvised woman, so too this has been a somewhat improvised funeral service, taking some liberties with different traditions. And I know that Muriel would just be overwhelmed by all the outpouring of love and support and gratitude and grief. And I think it was Valletta who said, "I wish that Muriel had known or could have absorbed just how much she's been cared for, how much she's moved people, how much we'll always take her with us." So Ken.
Muriel bought the toilet paper, and I changed the light bulbs. This was a gender joke that we never tired of in 26 years of sharing an office. And I think perhaps it says something, or it goes in some direction to say something about the kind of simplicity and extraordinary dimension of sharing a daily life. And over that quarter century, how that life came together and built in very quiet ways, I think. And in that spirit, I've been asked to read What the Living Do by Marie Howe. Johnny, the kitchen sink has clogged for days. Some utensil probably fell down there. And the Drano won't work, but smells dangerous. And the crusty dishes have piled up, waiting for the plumber I still haven't called. This is the everyday we spoke of. It's winter again, the sky's a deep, headstrong blue, and the sunlight pours through the open living room windows because the heat's on too high in there, and I can't turn it off. For weeks now, driving or dropping a bag of groceries in the street, the bag breaking, I've been thinking, this is what the living do. And yesterday, hurrying along those wobbly bricks in the Cambridge sidewalk, spilling my coffee down my wrist and sleeve, I thought it again. And again later when buying a hairbrush, this is it. Parking, slamming the car doors shut in the cold. What you called that yearning, what you finally gave up. We want the spring to come and the winter to pass. We want whoever to call or not call, a letter, a kiss. We want more and then more of it. but there are moments walking when I catch a glimpse of myself in the window glass, say the window of the corner video store. And I'm gripped by a cherishing so deep for my own blowing hair, chapped face, and unbuttoned coat that I'm speechless. I am living. I remember you.
I'm not a rabbi, and I'm certainly no cantor, but I think Muriel would know that I'm saying these very traditional prayers with intent and love and sincerity. El male rachamim shochein bamromim hamitzei menucha nechona al kanfei hashchina b'ma'alot kedoshim u'tohorim kazor harakia et nishmat Muriel Dimen shalcha la'olama ba'avur shenadvu tzedaka ba'ad hiskarat nishmata Lachein bal harachamim yastireha b'seter kanafav liolamim v'yitzror b'tzror hachayim et nishmata Adonai hu nachlata v'tanuach b'shalom al mishkava v'nomar Amen. O God, full of compassion, Thou who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the sheltering wings of Thy presence among the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament unto the soul of Muriel Dimen, who has gone into eternity. Lord of mercy, bring her under the cover of Thy wings, and let her soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Be Thou her possession, and may her repose be peace. Amen. Those of you who want to join me can say Kaddish.
I think there's like every other person. Somebody who needs.
Yes, please. Want to come on? Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah B'yalma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'yamru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach li'olam u'li'olmei olmaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitzpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitzhadar v'yitzhalev v'yitzhalal shmei dekudusha b'rechu le'ela mikol b'chata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amira v'alma v'yamru Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru Amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru Amen.
It's hard to end. But we have all our memories. We have each other. We'll be meeting together again in a couple of months for her memorial. And I thank you for coming. Yeah.
Explaining to him
Yeah.
the significance of this class.
Yeah.
So you were awesome. I'm
Oh,
not
God.
kidding.
You did such a beautiful. Oh, this is hard.
But we're going to stay.
What?
We're going to stay connected,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yes, really.
And we have all this gossip.
Yeah.